My name is Margaret Dudley. I'm from the Department of History here at Angelo State University, and this is Physiology and Food, Crises, Dietary Shifts, and Physical Health in Early 14th Century Europe. Now, the early 14th century in Europe was plagued by a series of disasters, which included the Great European Famine, the Great Bovine Pestilence, and the Black Death of 1348 to 1351. So this study examines how the early 14th century disasters in Europe affected food and how this led to changes in health after these disasters. In this research, I utilized graveyard studies, manorial accounts, household records, and contemporary writings to examine what people of different social classes of Europe ate before and after the early 14th century. Now, these medieval sources are compared with modern research to discover changes in physical health from these changes in diet and what this meant for these people and future generations. In order to understand really the significance of these changes, the study starts off with an examination of what people ate before the disasters. Now, this is divided into social class, and for ease of explanation, is divided into two social classes. The lower classes, which is comprised of peasants and laborers, and then the upper classes, which includes individuals such as priests and noblemen and potentially royalty. Now, the lower classes primarily consumed vegetables and grains, and they ate dairy as a large portion of their calcium and calorie intake. They were unable to afford a great variety in their diet, so they are actually seen to have suffered multiple vitamin and nutritional deficiencies as a result, as seen in graveyard studies such as those done by Sharon DeWitt and Philip Slavin. Now, the upper classes, for their part, were able to afford a greater variety and were able to avoid some of these vitamin and nutritional deficiencies. They also consumed vast quantities of meat and alcohol, although they consumed far less dairy. Vegetables and grains were more of a side element to their meat-centric dishes. Now, the disasters that occurred in the early 14th century started out with the Great European Famine. Climate shift led to severe crop failure in several successive years, leading to the largest crop failure Europe had ever seen. It is estimated that the Great European Famine killed roughly 10 to 15% of the European population. Around the same time, there was a cattle plague called the Great Bovine Pestilence. This spread by ongoing warfare throughout Europe and killed roughly 60% of Europe's bovid population. This completely destroyed the lower classes' source of dairy, which they depended on for a very significant part of their diet. And then finally, we have the Black Death in 1348 to 1351. The death rates of the Black Death are still sort of debated, but anywhere from 30 to 60% of Europe's population is thought to have died during the Black Death. And as horrible as these disasters were, their consequences weren't completely negative. For instance, because of the severe drop in population, laborers became even more valuable, and therefore they were able to negotiate for more and for better quality of food. These laborers began consuming more meat and ale as part of their diet in payment for their work, and they dropped off in their consumption of grains and dairy. This led to less widespread frailty and malnutrition as they were able to obtain more variety in their diet. Now, this also led to a hardier population from the more variety and a little better health, leading to a sturdier population that was better able to withstand later disasters, such as subsequent outbreaks of the Black Death later in the 14th century. Now, there are generational consequences to this change in health as well as the physiological responses to these disasters. Some of these include cardiovascular complications, metabolic disorders, and reproductive difficulties, to include spontaneous abortion. We see these sorts of symptoms also show up in more recent famine studies, things such as the Chinese famine. And these are sort of reflected in graveyard studies that have been done on this medieval population.